what I want to start by asking is just a very, very broad question. And then I want to get into a more specific question. The broad question is simply, what do you think the state should do?
Well, my view is you have to ask the question, why do we have a state? What's the purpose of the state? Why do individuals need a state? And I would argue they do. I'm not an anarchist. But I think you have to understand kind of the moral foundation of the moral purpose of a state. And I think we have to start with the fact that, from my perspective, the moral purpose of a human being is to live the best life that he can, to live a moral life, to live a happy life. And that requires certain things. And more than anything else, it requires that a human being be able to think for himself, to use his mind freely, to come to whatever conclusions he comes to, and to act on those conclusions. And that requires freedom. That requires the ability to think, to express oneself, free speech, for example, and then to act on those thoughts. And I think that in the 18th century, they came up with a concept, in a sense, capture this idea of freedom. This idea of the freedom of the individual to live his life as he sees fit. And that is the idea of rights, of individual rights, the kind of the Lockean notion of rights. Mm-hmm. And so I think individuals have rights as a moral necessity, so that they can live their lives to the best of their ability. And the right really means that you have the freedom of action to pursue your rational values, free of coercion, free of interference, free of fraud, free of authority that impose their will on you. And again, this comes from the experience in Europe of authorities, the church, the state, authorities that dictate to people how to live, what profession to have, who they could marry, and what discoveries were acceptable and what discoveries were not acceptable.
And
the state,
sorry.
Therefore, is the guarantor of those rights. So the state, therefore, sole purpose is the protection of those rights. So the state is there to protect you from the fact that when we come into society as individuals, we now are exposed to people who might want to impose their will on us, might want to defraud us, might want to use violence against us. Maybe that's, and typically that's only a minority of people, but it's still a significant minority, and force is a significant, is a major deterrent to thinking and acting. So the role of the state is to protect us from force, and it's to help define or define in legal terms. Objective means to decide who initiated force and who didn't. This is not necessarily an easy thing. To objectively define what are the boundaries of property rights and when are they infringed and when are they not. And property rights are complicated, and certainly in the internet age, they've only become, in a sense, more complicated. So that is the role of the state. It's to help define these boundaries and procedures, and then to enforce them, to protect our rights. So police, military, judiciary, that's it. Protection from obviously violence and fraud and theft and all of those kind of criminal offenses. But otherwise, and to arbitrate disputes. If the two of us have a contractual dispute, mm-hmm. One option could be for the state to arbitrate that contractual dispute based on the principles of property rights.
Okay, so you're not an anarchist. You believe there should be a state. The things the state should do include the state should make it legal for people to acquire private property, to inherit it.
Well, I see it reversed, right? They're not making it legal. They're recognizing your legal rights to your property. They're not making it legal, but they're helping define what it means to own property.
Right. Okay.
It's not always straightforward.
Okay, so they're recognizing an inalienable right to private property.
Yes.
To acquire it, to inherit it, et cetera. In your ideal society, murder would be illegal, theft would be illegal. There would be a police force to prevent those things, interpersonal violence, theft, et cetera. I think you also think there should be an army for national defense.
Definitely.
Correct? Okay.
Definitely.
And it was interesting you mentioned fraud, because fraud, on what What is the principled argument for having a state prevent person X from committing fraud against person Y?
So fraud, in a sense, I view fraud as violence. Fraud is a way of gaining gaining a value from you without your consent. Because your consent is undermined by the fact that I'm lying to you. So, so to the extent that I gain a value from you without your consent, that is a form of violence.
Oh, interesting. Okay, gotcha. Okay, and
again, it's not easy to define, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's, you need legal philosophers, you need a legislature, you need laws that clearly articulate what is fraud and what isn't fraud, what is, you know, what is just advertising versus what is fraud, right? Because you could have advertising that's, you know, hyping versus what is fraud. The two things are not the same, but it's not obvious. I don't have an answer to every one of the borderline questions, right?
Do you consider abortion a form of interpersonal violence or not? No. Okay.
So there's no person. There's a living being, but it's not a person. It's not an individual human beings, and rights can only apply to individuated human beings. You're only getting rights once you're born. Once you're born. Outside of the womb. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So two other specific questions about state functions. Okay. Well, actually three. So one regarding, so how in your ideal system would the revenue be generated?
In an ideal system, to some extent, it's hard to tell, right? Because there's a lot of time to think about this. But I'd say primarily through voluntary means. I think voluntary contributions to government in support of the police and the military. I mean, I have no doubt that my challenge would be that the government would have too much money, not too little. Also, you could imagine certain revenue, certain things that the government could do that would generate revenue. For example, if the two of us had a contract, and we could have in the contract private arbitration and private mediation and arbitration, but if we wanted the final authority to be the state, that is government courts, if we wanted that to be the final authority, we would, let's say, have to pay a fee to the court system in order to be the final guarantor of the contract. And that would fund the courts, because think about some of the big contracts that corporations sign with each other. I think patent offices, copyright offices would generate significant revenue. I think there are a number of things, ways in which you could generate revenue for certain services that are provided. But I think that the bulk, particularly for the military, things like the military, would have to come voluntarily. And I think one of the advantages of that is the state would have a very hard time engaging in war unless it was popular, right? And they would have to convince the people that it was popular, because otherwise people would hold funding. They, you know, and even if you think about even World War I and II, which certainly one, I think, was one of the dumbest wars in history, certainly for the United States to intervene. But they had to sell war bonds, and there was a whole campaign to sell war bonds. And they made an effort. Today they go to war. They don't care. I mean, they just run deficits or whatever, and they just go to war. There's no consideration of how it's going to be funded and convincing people of the justness of the war.
So, and just hypothetically speaking, if voluntary contributions weren't sufficient to prop up a sufficiently strong police force and army and court system, et cetera,
then the people will get the society they deserve.
Gotcha. Okay. So you have an absolute opposition to taxation, like forced taxation.
Forced taxation, absolutely. And you know, again, when we get to everybody paying 5% flat rate across the board and a bunch of taxes at zero, you know, that'll be a great day. I'll be celebrating.
Right, exactly. It won't be perfect, but it'll be a lot better than the current situation.
Exactly. But I do think that the perfect system and ultimately the system that is sustainable, because I think a 5% tax is not sustainable. You know, first income tax was 7%, only on the top 5% of owners, I think. And it very quickly, because of World War I, became a tax on everybody, and tax rates went through the roof very, very quickly. So once you establish the precedent, there's no limit to it. You need to get rid of the precedent. So yes, I think that voluntary taxation, I'm against coercion. So I'm against coercion, even if it's done by a majority, right? I'm you know, so it's democracy doesn't legitimize coercion.
And to begin with, I wonder if I can ask you to capsulize. I know this is difficult. Can I ask you to capsulize your philosophy? What is Randism?
First of all, I do not call it Randism, and I don't like that name. I call it objectivism.
All right.
Meaning a philosophy based on objective reality. Now let me explain it as briefly as I can. First, my philosophy is based on the concept that reality exists as an objective absolute, that man's mind, reason, is his means of perceiving it, and that man needs a rational morality. I am primarily the creator of a new code of morality which has so far been believed impossible, namely a morality not based on faith.
On faith?
Not on faith, not on arbitrary whim, not on emotion, not on arbitrary edict, mystical or social, but on reason, a morality which can be proved by means of logic, which can be demonstrated to be true and necessary.
All right, all right.
Now, may I define what my morality is?
All right.
Because this is merely an introduction. My morality is based on man's life as a standard of value. And since man's mind is his basic means of survival, I hold that if man wants to live on earth and to live as a human being, he has to hold reason as an absolute, by which I mean that he has to hold reason as his only guide to action, and that he must live by the independent judgment of his own mind, that his highest moral purpose is the achievement of his own happiness, and that he must not force other people, nor accept their right to force him, that each man must live as an end in himself and follow his own rational self-interest.
May I?
All right, before we go on, reminder, please like the show. We've got 163 live listeners right now, 30 likes. That should be at least 100. I figure at least 100 of you actually like the show. Maybe there are like 60 of the Matthews out there who hate it. But at least the people who are liking it, you know, I want to see a thumbs up. There you go. Start liking it. I want to see that go to 100. All it takes is a click of a thing, whether you're looking at this. And you know, the likes matter. It's not an issue of my ego. It's an issue of the algorithm. The more you like something, the more the algorithm likes it. So, you know, and if you don't like the show, give it a thumbs down. Let's see your actual views being reflected in the likes. But if you like it, don't just sit there. Help get the show promoted. Of course, you should also share. And you can support the show at JaronBrooksShow.com/support, or on Patreon or Subscribestar or Locals, and show your support for the work, for the value hopefully you're receiving from this. And of course, don't forget, if you're not a subscriber, even if you just come here to troll, or even if you're here like Matthew to defend Marx, then you should subscribe, because that way you'll know when to show up. You'll know what shows are on, when they're on. You'll get notified, right? So, yes, like, share, subscribe, support. Like, share, subscribe, support. There you go. Easy. Do one or all of those, please.